Let's start. The threats are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using King to G5, Rook to C3, King to F4. Another puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Rook takes bishop. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to C5, check. Answer to this puzzle is Queen to C5, check. King to H1. Knight to F2, check. Rook takes knight. Queen takes rook. One more. Threats in puzzle position are. Rook takes bishop, check. Rook takes rook. Knight takes queen. Bishop takes pawn. The checks are. Rook takes bishop, check. The answer is. Rook takes bishop, check. King takes rook. Knight takes queen. One more. The threats are. Bishop takes pawn. Here are the checks. Knight to B3, check. The best move in puzzle position is. King to G6. F4. Pawn takes pawn. E5. Bishop takes pawn. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are. Queen takes knight. Bishop takes pawn, check. Bishop takes knight. Checks in this position are. Bishop takes pawn, check. The answer is. Knight to D4. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes queen. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Rook takes pawn. Rook takes bishop. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are. Rook to E8, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Queen takes knight. Rook to F8. Bishop to D5. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes knight. Bishop to D6. Rook to D8. Bishop takes queen, check. Another puzzle. The threats are. Bishop takes knight. There are no checks in this position. The answer is. Bishop takes knight. Rook takes rook. Pawn takes rook. Next puzzle. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook to A4. King to H5. Rook takes knight. Let us go to the next puzzle. Threats in this position are. Bishop takes bishop. Here are the checks. Bishop to G4, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Bishop takes bishop. Queen takes queen, check. Bishop takes queen. Another puzzle. The threats are. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook. Knight takes bishop. The checks are. Rook takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes rook. Knight takes rook. Knight takes bishop. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Knight takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. The checks are. Knight takes pawn, check. Knight to G6, check. Answer to this puzzle is. Knight takes pawn, check. King to G8. Knight to D6. Pawn takes knight. Rook takes queen. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes bishop. Queen takes pawn, check. King to H8. Queen to H5, check. Another one. The threats are. Rook takes knight. Rook takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are. Rook to H1, check. Rook to G2, check. Rook to D1, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Rook to H2. Next, the threats are. Rook takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook to E3, check. Rook to E3, check. Rook to F2, check. The best move in puzzle position is. Rook to E3, check. King to G4. Rook to G2, checkmate. Let's continue. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Pawn takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes knight. Checks in this position are. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook, check. The answer is queen to h5. Bishop to e4. Pawn takes knight. Bishop takes knight. Pawn takes bishop. Let's continue. The threats are pawn takes rook. King takes rook. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. King takes rook. King to f2. King to f4. Let's continue. The threats are queen takes pawn. Queen takes rook. Queen takes bishop. Bishop takes knight. Checks in this position are rook to b1, check. Queen to b1, check. Answer to this puzzle is bishop takes knight. Next puzzle, here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes knight. Bishop takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn, check. Here are the checks. Bishop takes pawn, check. The answer is bishop takes pawn, check. King takes bishop. Queen takes queen. Next, here are the threats. Knight takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are rook to g6, check. Knight to f7, check. Knight takes pawn, check. The answer is knight to f7, check. King to h5. Rook to g5, checkmate. Next, the threats are pawn takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes knight. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is knight takes knight. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are queen takes knight. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is e5, f5. Pawn takes pawn. Queen to f7. Pawn takes bishop. Let's continue. Here are the threats. Rook takes knight. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to a3, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to a3, check. King to g8. Knight to e7, check. King to h7. Rook takes knight. Queen to c1, check. King to f2. Another puzzle. The threats are knight takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook to a2, check. The puzzle is solved using f3, b7. Knight to d6. Promotes to queen. Knight takes queen. Rook takes rook. Pawn takes rook. Next, let us look at threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop. Queen takes rook, check. Checks in this position are bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes rook, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes rook. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.